This is Eric Michael Lloyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuroscience concentration. I wanted to read a book, the Harvard Business Review, Leadership in a Changed World. This time I was going to read the chapter titled New World Disorder. Nicholas Checker, John McGuire, and Jonathan Barney. I'll start with the executive summary. It starts on page 47. On January 1st, 1995, representatives from 76 countries signed the World Trade Organization Charter, which for years had been part of a temporary trade agreement. The WTO's, World Trade Organization's, emergence as a fully empowered supranational body seemed to reflect the triumph of what the first President Bush had described as the New World Order. That order was based on two assumptions: that a healthy economy and a sound financial system make for political stability, and that countries in business together do not fight each other. The number one priority of U.S. foreign policy was thus to encourage the former communist countries of Europe and the developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa to adopt business-friendly policies. Private capital would flow from the developed world into these countries, creating economic growth. It sounded too good to be true, and so it proved. The world order of Bush, Pierre, and his successor, Bill Clinton, has been replaced by the New World Disorder of Bush-Fils. Under the second Bush's administration, the economic and political rationale behind the Washington Consensus of the 1990s has unraveled, forcing a radical change in our perceptions of which countries are safe for business. Negotiating this new environment will require companies to more rigorously evaluate political events and more carefully assess the links between political, economic, and financial risk factors. They'll need to be more selective about which markets to enter, and they'll need to think differently about how to position themselves in those markets. The geopolitical events of the past year, the Bush administration's global war on terror, as well as ongoing convulsions in traditional political and economic relationships, must be understood and managed by corporate leaders worldwide. With careful analysis, business leaders can increase their company's visibility and better respond to the uncertainties of the New World Disorder. On January 1st, 1995, at a very public ceremony in Geneva, representatives from 76 countries affixed their signatures to the Charter of the World Trade Organization. By the way, I should probably state that this book was written and has a copyright from 2004. So this book is at least 16 years old. May or may not have immediate relevance to the situation today. Perhaps they can also give some good pointers. Maybe. The moment had been more than a half century in the making. The WTO was the last of the children of Bretton Woods to come of age. Its sister bodies, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, all formed in the 1940s, but the WTO had for years been classified as a part of a temporary trade agreement. Its final emergence as a fully empowered supranational body seemed to reflect the triumph of what the first President Bush had described as the New World Order. That order was largely based on two assumptions. First, that a healthy economy and sound financial system make for political stability, and second, that countries in business together do not fight each other. U.S. foreign policy number one priority was clear: to encourage the former communist countries of Europe and the developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa to adopt business-friendly practices. Private capital would then flow from the developed world into these countries, creating economic growth and jobs. When free enterprise took hold, so the argument went, traditional grievances, resentments, and hostilities would fade. As people liked to say, no two countries with McDonald's had ever gone to war with each other. No two countries with McDonald's had ever gone to war with each other. The policy was backed with lots of money in the form of direct aid, loans from multilateral lending institutions such as the IMF, and a liquid market for governments to issue bonds to international private sector investors. Perhaps the most dramatic instance of this support was the U.S.-led bailout of Mexico after the so-called tequila crisis in 1994. In effect, the United States and other developed countries were sending a message: adopt economic reform, and we will be there to bail you out if your country gets into trouble. This reform path, called the Washington Consensus, involved fiscal discipline, trade liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and expanded property rights through legal reforms. Promoters of these reforms hoped the changes would make developing countries more attractive to foreign investment and would integrate those countries even further into a competitive but peaceful global economic network. In its most extreme form, the vision became one in which these countries would become part of a liberal, open world economy that promoted Western values such as democracy. For most of the 1990s, the developing countries were more than happy to oblige. By August 2000, with the membership of Albania, the number of WTO members had nearly doubled to 139. In the early 1990s, Latin American governments ushered in a raft of currency reforms, from Argentina's Currency Board 1991 to Brazil's Real Plan 1994. Eastern Europe countries, meanwhile, launched bold crash courses in privatization, including the Czech voucher program in 1992 and Russia's pre-election privatizations in 1996, as well as more gradual efforts by Hungary, Poland, and other countries. Aggressive modernization and reform in Southeast Asia earned the region's countries the sobriquet tiger economies. Tiger economies. The U.S. policy of putting business first made the world a much simpler place for managers. Many assumed that the export of capital from developed economies to less developed markets could be sustained indefinitely as soon as a country chose to be integrated into the new global economy. Its institutions would adapt under the same relentless pressure that was transforming enterprises around the world. Corporations could afford, therefore, to downplay political concerns in making decisions about investing in overseas markets. For corporations, it essentially boiled down to size. The bigger the country, the better and the safer. It seemed more dangerous to stay out of the large developing economies than to plunge in. A billion Chinese would buy an awful lot of cars, toothpaste, or shoes, and early birds would catch the most worms. Financial investors had a similar carefree attitude. As long as a country's currency could be freely exchanged and a liquid market was available in its debt, that country's economy was considered safe. When the IMF was behaving as lender of last, and in some cases first, resort, even though it never claimed to be, what did matter if a country's banking system was compromised? What did matter? What what did it matter if a country's banking system was compromised? It sounded too good to be true, and so it proved. The New World Order of Bush, uh, Perez, and his successor, Bill Clinton, has been replaced by the New World Disorder of Bush-Fils. Under the second Bush administration, the economic and political rationale behind the Washington Consensus of the 1990s has unraveled, forcing a radical change to our perceptions of which countries are and are not safe for business. Negotiating this new environment will require companies to more rigorously evaluate political events and their context than they are used to doing, and more carefully assess the links between the political, economic, and financial factors of risk. The New World Disorder raises the potential risks and rewards of specific tactical choices companies make. They will need to be more careful in selecting which markets enter and how to position themselves in them. The exhibit Risk in the New World Disorder summarizes how the risk factors have changed from order to disorder. It was in the late 1990s that we got our first taste of financial globalization's downside. Thailand's 1997 financial crisis set off another in Korea the same year. The economic virus spread to Russia the following year and in early 1999. Brazil was forced to abandon its fixed exchange rate policy. These countries had little in common, yet the financial crisis propagated from one to the next like a virus because the links created by the new global economy. The reason was simple. Although the destinations of foreign direct investment were far-flung and diverse, the source of that capital was not. The Western Bank that held Thai baht also held Brazilian real. The fund that owned Korean bonds also held Russian bills. In the belief that the IMF, with the United States behind it, was willing to bail out economies that ran into short-term trouble, many of these institutions had loaded up on these assets. Once a crisis started, however, these institutions had to reassess the risk of their entire emerging market portfolios. Such a reassessment would precipitate a progressive sell-off, with assets in the weaker countries going first. As a chart here, risks in the New World Disorder. The caption above the chart has the states, with the change in the U.S. international global policy, nearly all the basic assumptions about political, economic, and financial risks have been turned on their heads. The following table summarizes the changes. Risks in the left column starts with the first one, political risk, economic risk, and financial risks. Under political risk, for the column New World Order, those political risks are: more economic reform is better. Is the government pro-reform? For political risks, under New World Disorder, future reform is less likely. How strong are local institutions? For the second column, economic risks, continued world growth and convergence are inevitable. The business cycle is finished. How big is the market? For New World disorder, these economic risks, right? Growth is less certain and the business cycle more volatile. Convergence is less likely. Where is the market? And finally, financial column. For New World Order, the United States can't afford to let big markets fail. How liquid are the capital markets? And for financial risks under New World Disorder, the United States will bail out only its strategic allies. How important is the country to the Pentagon? Continuing on page 53, at first the IMF stepped in to help, but the costs of repeated multilateral bailouts became less and less affordable. Eventually, the Russian government defaulted, rendering near worthless the almost $40 billion in domestic government debt held by financial institutions and more than halving the $100 billion value in Russian equities. The United States did use its leverage to compel the IMF to aid Russia just prior to August 1999. However, it managed to buy less than a month of additional solvency. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that investors' belief that the United States would stand behind large, reform-willing countries had triggered a speculative bubble in those economies that was to burst with the Russian default. But not only the commitment and ability of the developed world to supply economic support was called into question. The developing countries were also proving less than successful at introducing the structural reforms that were supposed to be their side of the bargain. The forces of globalization had changed Russia's institutions so little that one civil servant characterized public sector aid to Russia as water poured into a sheet of glass. Privatization programs were shown to have done little more than enrich the ruling classes, even as ordinary people paid for the supposed economic liberation with their jobs. The hostility that this engendered among the often newly enfranchised voters only depended as foreign investors began turning off the taps. Ironically, the second President Bush put the final nail in the coffin of the New World Order. Even before September 11th, the administration was signaling that it had a very different vision of international engagement from its predecessors, one based on security, not economic concerns. And security was now defined not just in the narrow Cold War terms of safety from attack from a hostile, though stable superpower, but very broadly to include safety from terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, as well as vital economic inputs such as oil. In May 2001, President Bush and Vice President Cheney's national energy policy stated, "Energy security must be a priority of the United States or U.S. trade and foreign policy. We must look beyond our borders and restore America's credibility with overseas suppliers. In addition, we must build strong relationships with energy-producing nations in our own hemisphere, improving the outlook for trade, investment, and reliable supplies." It'll be 2001 President Bush. And as a side note, I did see the father's funeral, and obviously condolences go out to their family as well. The implication was clear. Security, in this case energy security, was now the foremost consideration in U.S. trade and foreign policy. The National Security Strategy of the United States of America, published in September 2002, shows how the thinking developed from there. It has become clear that the Bush government defines international engagement in terms of bilateral relationships with strategically important allies and unilateral confrontation with almost everybody else. With the United States less willing to provide the developing world with economic support, the incentive for those governments to support pro-business reforms has diminished. After initial backing more economic integration with the United States, the Mexican government under Vincent Fox has turned decidedly populist. Among other things, that means less progress on trade issues, such as the Mexican desire to renegotiate some aspects of the North American Free Trade Agreement. No longer can it be assumed that the Mexican government, or the U.S. government for that matter, is working to advance long-term convergence in such matters as wages, interest rates, and inflation between the two economies. The night that Vincent Fox won the 2000 election, an event that at last brought full democracy to Mexico, many ultimately proved to have been a high watermark for Mexican economic reform. Bush's new foreign policy chiefly means that the U.S. government will base its decisions on whether or not it will provide economic support less on a country's economic policies and market size, and more on its importance to U.S. national and international security. From a business perspective, such an approach means companies should no longer assume the developed world's macroeconomic policy will consist of marginal monetary adjustments and gradual fiscal consolidation. This completely changes the calculus of market entry, exit, and risk management decisions. Developing countries, once considered a sure bet for business, have become a lot less safe. Others, meanwhile, despite patchy economic performance, are looking stronger. Argentina has been one of the biggest victims of United States policy focus. In the 1990s, it had a succession of pro-reform governments, each with which hewed so close to the Washington consensus that Argentina was often referred to as the IMF's star pupil. Argentina's international credit remained strong, even as it piled up a mountain of external debt, partly out of the investors' belief that the IMF could not let the exemplar of its policy prescription fail. Today, Argentina is far from being America's darling. Not only has the country defaulted to private creditors, but it has even failed to make payments on debts to the World Bank. One IMF official described the fund's most recent agreement with Argentina as the divorce agreement. The performance of markets in countries of great strategic importance to the developed world, by contrast, has been remarkable. Turkey is the most obvious example. Back in the 1990s, Turkey found that its fractured political system was preventing it from making adequate fiscal and banking reforms. Those issues continue to worsen, yet even in the face of an unpredictable election, Turkish assets rose during the second half of 2002. Why? Financial markets judged that the United States would not let a Muslim ally suffer financial collapse. Indeed, it is now widely recognized that Turkey has to jump through fewer hoops to obtain IMF and US aid than it used to. The new priority being placed on Turkey's geographic position and its role model status as a secularized Muslim state means that it has privileged access. Of course, Turkey's strategic importance is an old story. The New World disorder, however, the value to the United States of Turkey's stability and geographic location is far more palpable and immediate than it was before. Another region that looks promising is the Indian subcontinent. See Opportunities in the New World Disorder, end of this article. Even developed economies are affected, albeit in a more nuanced way, by the sea of change in the geopolitical outlook. The acrimony raised in the debate over Iraq is unlikely to result in a trade war, but it will have a small but perceptible effect on the way the United States and European Union address certain issues. These include trade disputes, U.S. legislative extraterritorial, and competition regulations. Once again, the estrangement between the United States and its European allies has been several years in the making, for the new administration came into office determined not to let existing alliances constrain America's freedom of action. Indeed, last September's National Security Strategy document makes only passing references to NATO and Western Europe. Thus, the consensus of this assertiveness will probably linger well after Congress starts eating French fries again. Contextualizing political events, page 57. In coming to grips with the New World disorder, a business leader must first develop a detailed sense of the geopolitical outlook for the company's future strategic horizon. Essentially, the challenge is to develop a detailed scenario for the period under consideration. Without the discipline of a roadmap, managers typically react to events as they happen, ignoring their broader context and therefore completely misreading their significance. All too often, this results in a highly volatile and short-term approach to investing in developing countries. Past investment in Russia provides a perfect case study for this dynamic. Investors made the mistake of interpreting the victory of Boris Yeltsin over the Communist Party candidate in 1996 as a sign that Russia was safe for business. Since the communists were bad, Yeltsin must be good, right? Plus, the United States had a clear interest in the stability, at almost any cost, of the nation because Russia was the world's largest nuclear arsenal. To be sure, the Russian legal system's capricious nature deterred a lot of business investment and kept many a Western company from hurting itself. Nevertheless, plenty of Westerners and Western capital flowed in, making Moscow one of the most expensive cities in the world. After the 1997 default devaluation and debt moratorium, Russia went from being perceived as the world's brightest investment opportunity to being the worst. The new perception took such firm hold that investors almost completely missed the Russian recovery of 1999 to 2000. At that time, higher oil prices, the appointment of Vladimir Putin as the prime minister in August of 1999, his assumption of the presidency in January 2000, and his subsequent election to the post in August 2000 combined to transform Russia's economic and political landscape. Rating agencies noticed the improvement only toward the end of 2000. Standard & Poor's, for example, raised Russian long-term external debt from SD default to C only as late as December 2000. And the equity market didn't take note of Russia's much improved position until 2001. Today, the temptation is to assume that the September 11 terrorist attacks led to a reversal of the U.S. attitude toward Russia, and along with it, a sharp reduction in the risk of doing business there. Wrong again, on both sides of the hypothesis. The United States viewed Russia as a strategic partner before the attacks. In May of 2001, the administration released a comprehensive energy policy that implied that the United States was seeking to diversify its energy imports to reduce reliance on unstable regimes in the Middle East. Russia was clearly one of the intended beneficiaries of the new U.S. policy. The September 11 attack and the subsequent war with Iraq will actually make Russia strategically less important to the United States. With the removal of Afghanistan's Taliban and Iraqi Saddam Hussein, the U.S. government is betting the Middle East will become more stable, especially if Iraqi reconstruction goes well. This will reduce the U.S. need for Russian oil. By the way, I heard something today regarding Saddam Hussein on the NPR stating, referring to pulling out of Iraq too early after taking down Saddam Hussein and toggling over which one of those two errors were worse, taking out Saddam Hussein or pulling out of Iraq too early, because what came about after was even less manageable than before. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the Russian government firmly aligned itself with the United States. That alignment was the result of Putin's hasty assessment of Russia's economic interests and diplomatic influence, especially in the sensitive Commonwealth of Independent States near Afghanistan. A few visits to Russia's Central Asian neighbors showed the Russian president of his country did not have enough influence to prevent a sizable American presence from developing as the war against the Taliban drew near. At the same time, Kremlin personnel convinced Putin of the economic value of a better relationship with the United States. Historians will come to recognize that the alignment was purely temporary. By the end of 2002, the Russians had become well aware that their leverage over the United States would decline once hostilities in Iraq commenced, which was precisely why they were so opposed to the war during the UN negotiations early this year. What's more, the government had little to lose, but plenty to gain, from disapproval of the United States. Russian parliamentary elections are to occur in December. The presidential election will take place the next year, and defying the Americans play well to the domestic gallery. In the long run, Russian and American disengagement from each other may have more serious repercussions in terms of Russia's domestic stability. Kremlin nervousness over the outcome of elections, despite the lack of a viable alternative to Putin, has already prompted the government to roll back some of the liberalizing reforms of the post-Soviet era. Increased state control of the media, a key aim of Putin's Kremlin, is now complemented by a reconstitution of the old KGB under a new name. Long gone are the heady Yeltsin days when the West in general and the United States in particular were seen as a source of economic success and political truth. If we had just one recommendation for managers to make, it would be to read the September 2002 National Security Strategy. See Shifting Strategies Revealed at the end of this article. The document provides great insight into the current Bush administration's thinking, but it hasn't proved to be a perfect policy guide, as the United States even-handed treatment of India and Pakistan reveals. The link between risks. All managers recognize, in theory, that they have to look at the three factors, political, economic, and financial, of a country's risk together to get a sense of the totality of risks and opportunities. The trouble is, systematic analysis typically end up crudely aggregating the three factors, which is often why managers fail to predict sudden and dramatic crises that with hindsight they recognize as having been inevitable. Corporate leaders are not alone. International financial institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank are struggling with the same issues. Instead of merely cataloging the different risks, managers and policymakers need to look more closely at the links between them. The risks are linked. Then, when the risks are linked, then a local problem can easily escalate into an international crisis. Let's take a closer look at Argentina, which exemplifies this dynamic. On the face of it, the country was a low-risk prospect. To be sure, it had a high amount of external debt, but the country's banking system was the strongest in Latin America, in large measure because its currency, the peso, was freely convertible, placing a premium on sound monetary policy. As a result, Argentina had no trouble accessing international capital markets. The economic story also looked reassuring. Argentina had miraculously tamed the hyperinflation of the early 1990s. The recession of the late 1990s, caused by financial dislocation of the Asian crisis, could seemingly be reversed by a rather straightforward, if unpleasant, fiscal adjustment. The new De la Rua government had pledged to do that. The party alliance that brought Fernando de la Rua to office was fragile, but Argentina's strong presidential system had allowed Carlos Menem to put through far more difficult policies than anything de la Rua would have to enact. Or so it would appear. Unfortunately, the underlying political fractures in both de la Rua's Alianza party and the Peronist opposition fatally compromised all aspects of fiscal planning. Provincial governors had tremendous power over national policies as well as claims to federal budget. Once the provincial governors decided to confront the weak Alianza government, the fiscal adjustment needed to close the public finance gap went from manageable to enormous. As soon as debt holders caught wind of the problem, Argentina's debt load went from no problem to unsustainable overnight. The Argentine government then forced the banks to buy government debt at rates they would not accept in a free market. As the crisis continued to wear on, and Clinton's administration was replaced by Bush's administration, Washington dithered over the appropriate response, finally giving an aid package that did little to avoid what had become inevitable. Ultimately, Argentina defaulted, floated its currency, imposed capital controls, and nearly abandoned functional democratic processes. Anyone looking only at the economics of Argentina on the eve of the debt crisis would have seen a country actually beginning to emerge from a bad recession. A strictly financial analysis would not have identified Argentina as a leading candidate for crisis. The country having survived the crisis that forced the Russian government to default on its domestic government bonds and Brazil to devalue its currency. Politically, Argentina had been able to prosper through the 1990s under the same party system that federal structure that prevailed on the threshold of the crisis. Argentina's institutions seemed sound, but the favorable outlook for each of the risk factors was vulnerable to latent weaknesses in other factors. The economic recovery relied on Argentina's ability to continue to borrow on international capital markets. That ability, in turn, depended not just strong political institutions, but also on effective political will to maintain necessary fiscal discipline. With the government's fiscal discipline in question, markets demanded higher yields to take on the higher risk of Argentine debt. That damaged the economic recovery, further weakening the government and setting up the vicious cycle whose endpoint we all know. Ironically, companies that rely heavily on local experts are often the most likely to miss the signals for the kind of sudden crisis that arose in Argentina. The sheer volume and specificity of local experts' knowledge inevitably create a compelling picture of the political and economic environment in which a company operates. But specificity of knowledge does not preclude error. All local experts in Argentina in 2001 knew that Finance Minister Domingo Cavallo would fix the economy, or knew the IMF would always bail out Argentina. Local experts may provide useful eyes and ears on the ground, but are not in a position to know how U.S. or NGO policies will affect the country where they are based. These policies, made by outsiders, will frequently affect the local environment far more than will events on the ground. Local experts, in our experience, invariably are oblivious to the significance of broader international events. Over-reliance on local information sources eventually leads senior managers to confuse descriptive detail with accuracy and completeness of analysis. Tactics are critical. The next part. Opportunities in the New World Disorder and shifting strategies revealed. I'll read those three sections, page 63 through page 69, in the next video. Thank you for listening.